You are standing in Constantinople on May 29, 1453, watching Sultan Mehmed II enter the city gates. He's 21 years old. He's just accomplished what generations of Ottoman sultans failed to do. The walls that held for 1,000 years are broken. The greatest city in Christendom has fallen. He should be celebrating. Instead, he's weeping. Not tears of joy, tears of rage. Because 3 days ago, the man he respected most in the world, Emperor Constantine XI, disappeared into the chaos of the final assault, and no one can tell him where the body is. Mehmed wanted to give his enemy an honorable burial. He wanted history to remember this conquest as the meeting of two great minds. What he got instead was a mystery that would poison everything that followed. If you've made it this far, subscribe. We're about to explore how a sultan's grief turned the greatest military victory of his era into something much darker. The fall of Constantinople wasn't supposed to be personal. Mehmed II had been planning this siege since he was a child, drawing diagrams of the walls in the dirt, memorizing the accounts of every failed siege. When he became sultan at 19, he immediately began the largest military buildup the Ottoman Empire had ever seen. He commissioned the monster cannon that could fire 600-pound stone balls. He built a fortress on the Bosphorus in under 5 months, something his advisors said would take years. He assembled 80,000 men and a fleet of 126 ships. This was mathematics and engineering, strategy and logistics, the kind of methodical conquest that earns you a place in military academies. But there was one complication: Constantine XI Palaiologos. The last Byzantine emperor wasn't supposed to matter. Constantinople by 1453 was a ghost of its former self, a city of 50,000 people rattling around in walls built for 400,000. The empire had been reduced to the city itself and a few coastal territories. Constantine had maybe 7,000 defenders total, including 2,000 foreign mercenaries he could barely afford to pay. The math was overwhelming, the outcome inevitable. Yet Mehmed sent envoys before the siege began, offered Constantine safe passage and territories in the Peloponnese if he'd surrender the city peacefully, offered to pay him a yearly tribute. These weren't the terms you offer someone you consider irrelevant. Constantine refused, not with defiance or grand speeches, but with a letter so gracious it made the rejection somehow worse. To surrender the city to you is beyond my authority or anyone else's who lives in it. We have all decided to die with our own free will. Mehmed read that response and recognized something. Here was an emperor who understood what was coming and chose it anyway. An emperor who could have fled to safety in Italy or the Peloponnese. His brothers literally begged him to leave, but stayed because leaving would mean admitting the 1,000-year empire was already dead. Professional respect between enemies isn't common, but it happens. What made this different was the age gap. Mehmed was 21, Constantine was 48. Old enough to be Mehmed's father. And in a strange way, Constantine became the ideal of what Mehmed wanted, to be a ruler who made impossible decisions with dignity, who commanded absolute loyalty even when he had nothing left to give except his own example. The siege lasted 53 days. Modern people imagine historical sieges wrong. We picture constant battle, relentless attacks, dramatic standoffs. The reality is grinding monotony punctuated by moments of absolute terror. Days of positioning, artillery, building siege towers, filling in ditches, hours of cannon fire that pounds your nerves as much as the walls. Brief, horrifying assaults where hundreds die in minutes, followed by more waiting. The Theodosian walls of Constantinople were engineering perfection, a triple layer of fortifications that had turned back armies for a millennium. An outer wall, an inner wall, taller and thicker, and a third wall behind that. Moats and ditches between each layer. The defenders could rain arrows and stones down on attackers, stuck between walls with nowhere to hide. Mehmed's monster cannon in the basilica could crack those walls. But it took 3 hours to load, could only fire 7 times a day, and the recoil was so violent it had to be completely repositioned after each shot. After a month of bombardment, sections of wall were crumbling. But the Byzantines spent every night frantically rebuilding with rubble and timber. Plug the gaps, hold one more day. Constantine was everywhere during the siege, walking the walls at night, talking to exhausted defenders, redistributing his personal fortune to pay troops. When a section of wall collapsed, he was there organizing the repair. When morale cracked, he appeared with words that somehow made staying feel noble instead of suicidal. Mehmed watched this through his telescope from his red and gold tent outside the walls. Watched this emperor with no empire refuse to break. Here's what warfare does to psychology. The longer you fight someone, the more real they become. You learn their patterns, their habits, where they'll be and when. You develop a strange intimacy with your enemy. You understand their thinking better than you understand your own allies, because your life depends on predicting their next move. Mehmed knew Constantine was sleeping 3 hours a night, knew he'd personally led the defense at the weakest points, knew he'd refused to execute Ottoman prisoners, even when his own advisors demanded it. On May 28th, the final night before the last assault, Mehmed sent one more envoy, one final offer to surrender. Constantine's response: "I pray God that I may never be separated from this empire in life. Either I shall live or I shall die here with my city." This was the conversation Mehmed wanted to have in person. After the victory, ruler to ruler. That's what commanders do when the battle is over, and both sides fought with honor. You sit down, you acknowledge what happened, you move forward. But that required Constantine to survive. The final assault began at 1:30 a.m. on May 29th. Mehmed sent wave after wave of Bashi Bazouks, first irregular troops, essentially cannon fodder meant to exhaust the defenders. They attacked for 2 hours, took devastating casualties, achieved nothing, except forcing the Byzantines to burn through ammunition and energy. Then came the Anatolian troops, better trained, better equipped. They managed to reach the walls, plant ladders, engage in brutal hand-to-hand combat on the ramparts. Constantine appeared in the thick of it, purple imperial robes abandoned for plain armor, fighting with his generals and common soldiers. The Anatolians couldn't break through. At dawn, Mehmed committed the Janissaries, the elite infantry of the Ottoman Empire. Taken as children, trained for war, fanatically loyal, Mehmed led them forward himself, riding close enough to the walls that arrows landed around his horse. This is the moment when everything turned on one architectural quirk no one had paid attention to. The Cercaporta was a small wooden door built into the wall, used by the defenders to launch counterattacks. Someone history still doesn't know who forgot to lock it after a sortie. Or maybe left it open deliberately. The door was so insignificant that Byzantine chronicles don't even mention its location precisely. A group of Janissaries found it, pushed through. Suddenly, they were inside the walls with no one expecting them. The defenders turned to face this new threat, and the Genoese mercenary commander Giovanni Giustiniani, the military genius holding the entire defense together, took an arrow or bullet in the chest. Not a fatal wound, but painful and bleeding enough that his men carried him off the walls to get medical attention. Constantine saw Giustiniani being carried away and knew what it meant. The defenders watched their best commander leave, and the psychological collapse was instant. This is how battles are actually lost, not when the walls break, but when the collective will to defend them evaporates. Constantine could have run. His guards begged him to run. Escape routes still existed. Ships in the harbor ready to evacuate anyone important enough to matter. Instead, he tore off his imperial regalia, the symbols that marked him as someone worth capturing for ransom, and plunged into the mass of Ottoman troops pouring through the breached wall. His last recorded words: "The city is fallen, and I am still alive." Witnesses reported seeing him fighting near the gate. Then, nothing. He vanished into the chaos of thousands of men killing each other in narrow streets, smoke and screaming and collapsing buildings. By noon, the battle was over. The Ottoman flag flew above Constantinople. Mehmed entered the city in triumph, rode to the Hagia Sophia, dismounted, picked up a handful of dust and poured it over his head in a gesture of Islamic humility. The custom, after capturing a city, was simple: 3 days of plunder for the troops. Mehmed allowed this. It's what the soldiers expected, what kept them loyal. But there were limits. Execution without trial was forbidden. The burning of buildings was forbidden. And Mehmed personally intervened to stop the destruction of churches and monuments. This was his city now. He wanted it intact. But he also wanted something else. He sent criers through the streets. Anyone who could identify the body of Constantine XI would be rewarded. He sent troops to search the piles of dead at the gates. He questioned prisoners. He offered amnesty to any Byzantine soldier who could lead him to the emperor's remains. Nothing. Some claimed they'd seen Constantine fall near the Street Romanus gate. Others said the Golden Gate. Maybe the top copy. Bodies were everywhere, thousands of dead and dying, many stripped of armor and identifying marks by looters, trampled by horses, burned in fires, already beginning to decompose in the late May heat. Days passed. The searches continued. Mehmed's frustration mounted. Eventually, some Ottoman soldiers presented a body, headless, wearing expensive boots embroidered with double-headed eagles, the imperial symbol. This might be Constantine. Or it might be any wealthy Byzantine who could afford decorative footwear. Mehmed had the head mounted on a column in the Forum, then sent it on a tour of major Islamic cities as proof of his conquest. The body, if it was Constantine's, received a burial Mehmed considered honorable. But he never knew for certain, and that uncertainty aided him. Here's what Mehmed wanted. He wanted to stand over Constantine's body and pay respects. Wanted to acknowledge that this man had held an impossible position with dignity until the end. Wanted historians to record that Sultan Mehmed II honored his greatest enemy. This was how you built a reputation that lasted centuries, not just by winning, but by winning with magnanimity. What he got instead was ambiguity, a maybe body, a maybe burial, and no way to tell the story the way he'd imagined it. So the story that spread through the Ottoman court was different. Constantine had fled, tried to escape, and was cut down like a coward. Or maybe he'd killed himself rather than face capture. Or maybe he'd disguised himself as a common soldier and was rotting in an unmarked grave somewhere, indistinguishable from the thousands of other dead. These weren't the rumors Mehmed wanted circulating. They diminished the victory, made it sound like he'd conquered a city defended by someone who didn't even have the courage to die properly. The psychological shift was subtle but profound. Mehmed had prepared for magnanimity. He'd psyched himself up to be gracious. But magnanimity requires a recipient. You can't be honorable toward a memory, toward an uncertainty, toward someone who might have been a coward. And when magnanimity curdles, what replaces it isn't neutrality, it's resentment. 3 days after the city fell, Mehmed ordered something that violated his own earlier commands. He wanted the remaining Byzantine aristocracy brought before him. Not for execution would have been cleaner. He wanted them to watch as he systematically dismantled everything that remained of their culture. The great families who'd ruled Byzantium for centuries were forced to prostrate themselves. Their estates were confiscated, their titles abolished. Their children, taken for the Devshirme system, converted to Islam, trained as janissaries or administrators, cut off forever from their heritage. This wasn't policy, this was personal. Historical records show Mehmed was unusually involved in these humiliations. Most sultans delegated this kind of administrative cruelty. Mehmed attended personally, watched faces, made sure the former aristocrats understood that everything they'd inherited, everything that connected them to a 1,000-year-old empire, was being erased. The systematic destruction of Byzantine monuments accelerated. Buildings that survived the initial sack were torn down for building materials. Mosaics were plastered over. Libraries were emptied. Manuscripts scattered or burned. Mehmed had initially ordered preservation, now he seemed indifferent to what was lost. Here's the thing about revenge. It's often misdirected. Mehmed couldn't take his frustration out on Constantine. Constantine was gone, untouchable, transformed into an ambiguous legend. So the frustration landed on everyone and everything else connected to Byzantium. The scholars who'd been promised positions in Mehmed's new administration found themselves marginalized. The merchants who'd been guaranteed trading rights faced arbitrary seizures of property. The churches that were supposed to be protected saw their bells melted down, their relics looted, their buildings repurposed without the gradual transition Mehmed had initially promised. And when Mehmed's advisors questioned these decisions, pointed out that he was undercutting his own stated goals of creating a cosmopolitan capital that blended Ottoman and Byzantine culture, his response was always some variation. The emperor abandoned his city. His people don't deserve its legacy. This was projection, obviously. Constantine hadn't abandoned anything. But Mehmed needed that narrative. Needed to believe he'd conquered cowards rather than heroes. Because conquering cowards doesn't require magnanimity. The long-term consequences rippled outward. Mehmed's initial vision for Constantinople had been genuinely remarkable for its era, a capital where Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities coexisted under Ottoman rule, where the architectural and intellectual heritage of Byzantium enriched Islamic civilization. He'd said this explicitly in letters before the siege. He wanted to be remembered as the Sultan who didn't just conquer Constantinople, but who elevated it. That vision gradually withered. By the time Mehmed died in 1481, possibly poisoned, possibly by his own son, Constantinople had been transformed into Istanbul, and the transformation was more erasure than synthesis. The Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, was now a mosque. The forums and monuments that had defined the city's identity for a millennium were being systematically dismantled. The Greek population that remained lived in designated quarters, their freedoms steadily restricted. This wasn't inevitable. Mehmed had the power to shape the city's future any way he wanted. But the absence of Constantine, the inability to conclude the story the way Mehmed had imagined, poisoned that creative vision. Here's the historical irony. Mehmed got exactly what he claimed to want. He conquered Constantinople. He ended the Byzantine Empire. He secured his place in history as one of the great conquerors. His name is still revered in Turkey today. Children learn about Mehmed the Conqueror in school. Statues of him tower over public squares. But the conquest he's celebrated for isn't the one he actually achieved. The Mehmed who entered Constantinople on May 29, 1453, weeping at the fall of a great civilization, trying to find his enemy's body to honor it, that Mehmed is mostly forgotten. The story that survived is simpler. Young Sultan conquers ancient city, smashes old empire, builds new one on its ruins. Triumph without complexity. Mehmed wanted to be remembered as the Sultan who honored Constantine. Instead, he's remembered as the Sultan who erased him. And maybe that's fitting, because erasure was ultimately what happened. Constantine's body, if that headless corpse was really him, went into a grave that was eventually forgotten. No tomb, no marker, no place for future generations to pay respects. The emperor who refused to abandon his city vanished from it so completely that 5 centuries later, we still don't know where his remains are. Archaeologists have searched. The most likely location is somewhere in the area of the Street Romanus Gate, but the city has been built over so many times that finding anything is nearly impossible. Constantine is literally beneath Istanbul, part of its foundation, invisible. Let's talk about what this reveals about victory. We imagine conquest as a moment of absolute clarity. Winners and losers, glory and defeat. The victor dictates terms, the vanquished accept them, history moves on. But Mehmed's experience shows something more complicated. Victory can feel incomplete even when it's total. You can achieve every objective, surpass every expectation, accomplish what your predecessors failed to do, and still feel cheated if the narrative doesn't match what you imagined. Mehmed needed Constantine alive in defeat or identifiable in death. Needed that moment of acknowledgement between equals. Needed to demonstrate that he wasn't just a conqueror, but a ruler who understood honor and legacy. Without that moment, the victory felt hollow, and hollow victories breed cruelty. This is the pattern we see repeated throughout history. Victors become vicious not when they're insecure about their strength, but when they're insecure about their legitimacy. Mehmed's strength was obvious. He just conquered Constantinople. But legitimacy required something more. Proof that he'd defeated someone worth defeating, someone who'd fought with dignity, someone whose surrender or honorable death would reflect well on the victor. Constantine's disappearance denied him that proof. So Mehmed did what people do when they can't process disappointment. He reframed the narrative. Constantine became a coward, Byzantium became unworthy, and the systematic destruction of Byzantine culture became justified. This wasn't conscious deception. Mehmed probably believed his own revised story. That's how rationalization works. You tell yourself the story that makes your actions make sense. The tragedy is that Constantine gave Mehmed exactly what he asked for. Constantine stayed when he could have fled, fought when he could have surrendered, died, we're pretty sure, rather than be captured. He did everything a noble enemy should do. But because the evidence of that nobility got lost in the chaos of battle, because no one could definitively say, here is where the emperor fell, here is how he died, the nobility became invisible, and invisible nobility might as well not exist. Here's the haunting detail that crystallizes everything. In 1461, 8 years after the conquest, Mehmed visited the ruins of the palace of the Porphyrogenitus, where Byzantine emperors had been crowned. The palace was empty, stripped of everything valuable, slowly collapsing. Mehmed stood in the throne room and reportedly recited a Persian poem about the impermanence of glory. An attendant recorded this moment but didn't include the specific poem. We don't know what Mehmed said. We don't know what he was feeling. Just like we don't know where Constantine's body is. Just like we don't know if the grief Mehmed showed on entering Constantinople was genuine or performed. The historical record is full of these gaps, moments where something crucial happened but the details vanished, and we're left trying to reconstruct meaning from fragments, trying to understand how a 21-year-old conqueror could achieve total victory and somehow lose what he actually wanted. Maybe that's the real lesson. The stories we tell ourselves about what victory will feel like rarely match the reality. We imagine vindication, satisfaction, the sense of having earned something valuable. What we often get instead is the achievement plus everything that's missing from it. The costs we didn't anticipate, the losses that weren't supposed to matter but do, the people we needed to acknowledge us who aren't there anymore. Mehmed thought conquering Constantinople would make him immortal. And in a sense it did, his name endures. But the person he needed to see that immortality, to validate it, to make it feel real, was Constantine. And Constantine was gone. So Mehmed turned his grief into policy, his disappointment into cultural erasure, his need for acknowledgement into systematic revenge against a civilization that couldn't defend itself anymore. This is what unprocessed emotion does when wielded by someone with absolute power. It compounds, it spreads, it finds targets that make no strategic sense, but perfect psychological sense. You can't hurt the person who hurt you, so you hurt everyone connected to them. You can't get the closure you need, so you try to close the chapter by destroying everything that reminds you the chapter isn't closed. Mehmed lived another 28 years after conquering Constantinople. He conquered more territories, fought more wars, built the foundations of an empire that would last centuries. By all historical measures, he was wildly successful, but contemporaries noted he never displayed the same emotional investment in any conquest after 1453. It was as if the thing he wanted most, the acknowledgement of Constantine, the completion of that specific story, had been the only prize that really mattered, and once that was lost, everything else became administrative. There's an Ottoman chronicle from late in Mehmed's reign where he's discussing his legacy with advisors. Someone suggests that future generations will remember him as the conqueror of Constantinople, the sultan who achieved what others couldn't. Mehmed's response: they'll remember the conquest, they won't remember what it cost. The chronicler assumed he meant the financial cost, the military casualties, the years of planning, but read in context of everything else, it sounds like Mehmed was talking about something more personal. What it cost to win completely but feel defeated. What it cost to achieve a dream and discover the dream was incomplete. What it cost to turn victory into revenge, because revenge was easier than admitting the victory wasn't enough. Constantinople fell on May 29th, 1453. But in a real sense, it kept falling for decades afterward, not through military action, but through the accumulated weight of Mehmed's disappointment, expressed as policy, enacted as cultural destruction, justified as historical necessity. And Constantine, the emperor who did everything right, who stayed when others fled, who refused to let his empire die dishonorably, is remembered today mostly as a footnote, the last Byzantine emperor, the guy who lost. Occasionally mentioned in documentaries about the fall of Constantinople, but rarely granted the complexity he deserves. We don't talk about how he held an impossible position against overwhelming force. We don't talk about how his presence kept the defense together for 53 days when it should have collapsed in 53 hours. We don't talk about how his refusal to flee or surrender gave Byzantium a dignified ending instead of a pathetic one. We talk about Mehmed the Conqueror, because conquerors get the narrative. But here's what we should remember. Mehmed spent the rest of his life trying to erase Constantine, and he failed. Byzantine scholars and refugees carried their culture to Italy, where it helped spark the Renaissance. The double-headed eagle Constantine wore on his boots became a symbol of Orthodox Christianity and appears on flags and emblems to this day. Constantine himself became a folk hero, a martyr, a symbol of resistance against impossible odds. And the story of his last stand charging into battle when he could have fled, dying somewhere in the streets of his own city, defending walls that were already broken, that story survived. It survived Ottoman censorship, it survived centuries of cultural suppression, it survived the physical transformation of Constantinople into Istanbul. Mehmed got the city, Constantine got the legend. Maybe that's why Mehmed wept when he entered Constantinople. Not just grief for Constantine, though that was part of it, but some premonition that achieving everything you thought you wanted wouldn't feel the way you imagined. That closure is sometimes impossible. That you can kill your enemy without defeating them, conquer their empire without claiming their legacy, win the battle while losing the thing that made winning meaningful. History is full of victories that feel like defeats, and defeats that feel like victories. But Mehmed and Constantine's story is unique because it's both at once. Mehmed defeated Constantine and spent decades trying to process why that didn't feel like victory. Constantine was defeated by Mehmed and somehow won anyway by denying him the closure that would have made the defeat complete. They're bound together now, these two men who never got the conversation they both wanted. The 21-year-old sultan who conquered the world and the 48-year-old emperor who defended the ruins of glory. Every time we tell the story of Constantinople's fall, we're forced to tell both stories, because neither makes sense without the other. Mehmed needed Constantine to validate his conquest. Constantine needed Mehmed to bear witness to Byzantine honor. Neither got what they needed. Both got immortality anyway, but the kind of immortality that comes with asterisks and complications and unresolved tensions that echo across centuries. So here's the question worth sitting with. How many victories in your own life are actually like this? How many times have you achieved what you said you wanted, only to discover the achievement felt incomplete because some crucial element, acknowledgment, closure, validation, was missing? How many times have you turned that incompleteness into resentment, that resentment into cruelty, that cruelty into a story you told yourself about why you were justified? And look, I need to ask you a question. Are you doing it right now? Is there some victory in your life that doesn't feel like victory because the person you needed to see it isn't there anymore? Are you taking that disappointment out on people who had nothing to do with it? Mehmed had armies and empires. You probably don't. But the psychological pattern is the same. Unprocessed grief becomes misdirected revenge. Incomplete victories breed systematic cruelty. The need for validation from someone who can't give it anymore curdles into resentment toward everyone else. Mehmed had 28 years and absolute power to process his disappointment. He never did. You might not have absolute power, but you have something he didn't. The ability to recognize the pattern before it consumes decades of your life. If you've made it this far, you're someone who values the uncomfortable truths hiding in history. Subscribe and turn on notifications. There are more forgotten stories to uncover together. Thanks for watching.